My daughter-in-law chose a Tuesday to do it. Not a weekend, not a holiday, a plain Tuesday in February when the roads were icy and I had nowhere to go. She called me at 8 o'clock in the morning, said my son wanted to have a family meeting at my house. I made coffee. I put on a decent shirt. I sat at my own kitchen table and waited for them like a guest. They arrived together, the three of them, my son, his wife, and their oldest boy, who was 17 and had no business being at a meeting like that. I found out later they brought him because they thought I wouldn't make a scene in front of a grandchild. They were right about that. I didn't make a scene. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Conrad. I'm 68 years old. I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, to a family that had nothing and made do with nothing for a long time. My father worked the blast furnace at Stelco for 31 years. My mother cleaned offices downtown 3 nights a week and never once complained about it. Not to me, anyway. They bought a small house on Cannon Street in 1971 for $42,000 and they paid it off in 19 years. When my father handed me the deed after my mother passed, he said, "This is what you leave people, Conrad. You leave them something solid." I took that seriously. I spent 30 years building a plumbing and heating business out of nothing. Started with a second-hand van and a set of tools I bought at an estate sale in Stony Creek. By the time I was 50, I had 14 employees, 2 service trucks, 3 vans, and a commercial contract with a property management company that handled 17 buildings across the Hamilton area. I also owned a duplex on Barton Street I'd renovated myself over 2 summers. And my house, the house I'd bought in Ancaster in 1998, a 4-bedroom brick home on a corner lot with a double garage and a backyard my late wife Eleanor planted completely from scratch. Roses along the fence, a Japanese maple near the back door that was now 25 feet tall. Eleanor died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't say more than that because even now I can't write it without stopping. After she was gone, the house was too big. I knew that. My son knew that too. And I think that's when the idea first started forming in his head. Though I'm only seeing that clearly now. His name is Gideon. He's 41. He married a woman named Priscilla 11 years ago. And I really tried to like her. She's not a bad person. Exactly. She's the kind of person who looks at every room she walks into and calculates what it would look like if it were hers. I noticed it at family dinners. The way her eyes moved around my house, over the fireplace, along the crown molding, out the window at the yard, she'd smile and compliment something. And then 2 days later, Gideon would call and suggest I simplify. Simplify. That was the word they used constantly after Eleanor died. Dad, wouldn't it be simpler to sell the duplex? Dad, wouldn't it be simpler to let someone else manage the business contracts? I was 66 years old and physically healthy. I hiked the Bruce Trail twice a year. I still drove my own truck. I had a bookkeeper named Sylvia, hired from outside, not from the list, who had worked with me 15 years and knew the business as well as I did. There was nothing to simplify. I wasn't declining. I was grieving, which is different. But grief, I came to understand, looks like vulnerability to people who are watching for it. The Tuesday meeting. They sat down and Gideon put a folder on my kitchen table. Inside was a brochure, full color, glossy, for a place called Meadowvale Gardens in Dundas. Retirement living independent and assisted options. Amenity-rich community. Priscilla had highlighted things in yellow. The indoor pool, the dining room, the activity calendar. Gideon started talking in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Careful, rehearsed. He said he'd been worried about me living alone. He said the house was a lot to maintain. He said Eleanor would have wanted me to be somewhere I was looked after. He actually said that Eleanor would have wanted it. I looked at my grandson sitting against the wall with his phone in his lap, eyes down. I looked at Priscilla, who was watching me with something arranged on her face that was meant to look like concern. I looked at my son. I said, "I'm not moving." Gideon said he'd expected me to say that. He nodded like he'd rehearsed the nod too. Then he said, "Dad, we've already spoken to a lawyer." What I didn't know, and what I should have known to watch for, was the paper I'd signed 18 months earlier. After Eleanor's death, Gideon had helped me with some estate paperwork, her pension, her accounts, a few insurance forms, and among those documents, there had been a power of attorney form for continuity, Gideon said. Just in case. You're not getting any younger, Dad. I signed it. I was exhausted with grief and I trusted my son and I signed it. He had taken that document to a lawyer and used it as the foundation for a capacity assessment application. He told the lawyer I was showing signs of cognitive decline. He'd mentioned that I'd missed a business payment in October, which was true, but I disputed an invoice and the delay was intentional. He mentioned I'd left the stove on once. He mentioned that Eleanor's death had significantly affected my judgment. 3 weeks after that Tuesday meeting, a social worker appeared at my door with a court document. My son had applied for legal guardianship over my personal care and my property. I remember reading the application standing in my own doorway with February wind coming through the screen. My hands didn't shake. I was too angry for my hands to shake. I read my own son's description of me, disoriented, unable to manage daily affairs. At risk of financial exploitation. At risk of financial exploitation. I almost laughed. I called the only lawyer I'd ever trusted, a man named Terrence who'd handled my business contracts for 20 years. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday. He picked up himself, which Terrence always did. I said, "My son is trying to have me declared incompetent." I heard him exhale slowly. I told him about the power of attorney, the capacity application, the whole Tuesday meeting. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Conrad, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Don't speak to anyone from his legal team without me present. I'll file a response by end of week." The hearing was set for 8 weeks out. Terrence told me to get my own capacity assessment done immediately through a geriatric specialist he knew at McMaster. He said we needed documentation. I went the following Monday. The specialist, a woman in her 50s with the calm manner of someone who has seen everything, put me through 3 hours of cognitive testing, verbal memory, spatial reasoning, executive function. She asked me who the Prime Minister was, what year I was born to count backward from 100 by sevens. She asked me to explain my business finances. I explained them in detail for 45 minutes. She said, "Mr. Bine, Conrad, there is absolutely nothing here that would support a finding of incapacity." She said it plainly, the way people say things they've said many times and believe completely. I nodded. I drove myself home on the 403 in the February dark, and I sat in Eleanor's kitchen, and I thought about what my son had done and why. The answer was the house. Not just my house in Ancaster, the duplex too, and the business. Because with guardianship over my property, Gideon would have had the authority to manage my company. To sell it, wind it down, redirect its assets. Terrence confirmed it. Under Ontario's Substitute Decisions Act, a property guardian has very broad powers. Gideon had done his research. Priscilla, I suspected, had done more of it. What they hadn't counted on was that I had done mine too. After the Tuesday meeting, after I'd sat alone in the kitchen for an hour, I'd called Terrence's office and left a message before they'd even reached the end of my driveway. And before I went to bed that night, I'd called my bookkeeper, Sylvia, and told her, "Nobody from my family has signing authority on anything. If Gideon or Priscilla contact you, tell them nothing and call me immediately." Sylvia had worked with me for 15 years. She said, "I figured something was going on. I'll lock everything down tonight." The weeks before the hearing were the strangest of my life. Gideon called twice. Both times I let him go to voicemail. He left messages in that same careful rehearsed voice, saying he was worried, saying this was about my well-being, saying he hoped I understood they were doing this out of love. I played the messages to Terrence. He listened without expression and said, "Save those." I went to the house every day, which was maybe a strange thing to say about a house I still lived in, but that's what it felt like. Like I was visiting, checking on it, making sure it was still mine. I walked through the rooms. I watered Eleanor's plants, the ones I'd kept alive in the windows. I sat in her chair by the back window some evenings and looked at the Japanese maple bare and black against the snow, and I thought about what I was going to do. Terrence was building our response. The capacity assessment from McMaster. 14 years of tax returns showing consistent rational financial management. Letters from my business contacts, including the property manager who'd worked with my company for 9 years, attesting to my clarity and competence. My hiking partner, a retired teacher named Aldous, wrote a letter describing our twice-yearly trips in detail. Conrad plans the routes, manages the equipment, leads every leg of every trail. My doctor of 23 years wrote that I was in excellent physical health with no neurological concerns flagged to any examination. And then Terrence did something I hadn't expected. He filed a counter-application. He argued that Gideon had misrepresented my condition in the original filing, that the power of attorney had been obtained under false pretenses, specifically that it had been presented to me as routine estate paperwork during a period of acute grief, when I was processing Eleanor's death without independent legal advice. He argued the application itself was an abusive process intended to facilitate financial gain. The week before the hearing, Gideon's lawyer called Terrence and made an offer. Gideon would withdraw the application. In exchange, I would agree to sell the house, give them first right of purchase at assessed value, and place the proceeds in a trust they would co-manage. Terrence read it to me over the phone. I said, no. He said, that's what I told him. Then he paused and said, Conrad, I want you to know this is going to be a very uncomfortable day in court. I said, I knew. He said, you understand it will all be in the public record. I said, I understood. I understood completely. The public record was fine with me. The hearing was on a Wednesday in April. The courtroom at the John Sapinka Courthouse in Hamilton was smaller than I'd imagined. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. Terrence sat beside me in a dark suit. Gideon and Priscilla sat at the other table with her lawyer, a younger man who I'd been told was expensive. Gideon didn't look at me when I came in. Priscilla looked at the wall. The judge was a woman in her 60s, no nonsense, who read through the submissions before saying a word. She asked Gideon's lawyer to walk her through the basis for the original capacity application. He cited the mispayment in October, the stove incident, the claim of emotional deterioration. The judge looked up from the papers. She said, Counsel, the capacity assessment submitted by the respondent was conducted at McMaster Medical Center by a certified geriatric specialist and shows no cognitive impairment whatsoever. What independent assessment did your client obtain before filing? Gideon's lawyer said they had relied on the observations of the family. The judge said, the observations of a family with a direct financial interest in the outcome. There was a silence in the room that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except me. Terrence presented the financial records, 14 years of returns, the business contracts, the letters. He walked through each document the way he'd walked through thousands of documents in his career, steadily without drama, letting the facts arrange themselves. The judge took notes. Gideon's lawyer tried to raise the stove incident again, and the judge cut him off counsel. Leaving a stove on does not establish incapacity. If it did, we'd have half the province under guardianship. There was a sound in the gallery, a small involuntary sound that might have been a laugh. I didn't turn around to look. The judge ruled in my favor before noon. She dismissed the guardianship application entirely. She found that the power of attorney had been obtained in circumstances that raised serious concerns and declared it void. She awarded full costs against Gideon. Then she said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. She looked directly at my son, not at his lawyer, at him, and said, Mr. Gideon, the court is deeply concerned by the nature of this application. Your father is a mentally competent adult who has built and managed substantial assets over a lifetime. Filing an application of this kind against a grieving, competent parent is not an act of love. I hope you will reflect on that. Gideon said nothing. Priscilla was already looking at her phone. We went for lunch after Terrence, Sylvia, and Aldous, who had driven in from Burlington to be there. We went to a diner on King Street that Terrence liked, one of those places with vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee and heavy ceramic mugs. Terrence ordered the beef dip. Sylvia got soup. Aldous got a club sandwich and immediately started pulling the toothpick out of it and talking. He said, I always knew that boy wasn't right. Sylvia said, Aldous, he said, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. We ate lunch. We talked about the Bruce Trail trip we had planned for September, a section near Collingwood we hadn't done yet. I drank 2 cups of coffee and I sat in that booth and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since February. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than happiness, like weight being put down. The legal costs were significant. Terrence was not inexpensive, and the hearing preparation had taken months. But I'd had Sylvia quietly run the business accounts to make sure nothing had been touched, and the duplex was generating steady rent, and my savings were intact. I was not a man without resources. I had spent 30 years making sure of that. My son and I haven't spoken since the hearing. He sent one text 2 weeks later. It said, "I hope you're okay." I read it several times. I thought about what to say. I thought about Eleanor, who would have known exactly what to say, who had always known what to say. I thought about my father handing me the deed to the house on Cannon Street and saying, "This is what you leave people." I thought about all of it. Then I put my phone down and went out to the backyard and stood under the Japanese maple which was starting to come back. The first green at the ends of the branches tentative and small. I stayed there for a while. Just stayed there. I did not text him back. The house in Ancaster is still mine. The duplex is still mine. The business is still mine. And last year we picked up 2 new commercial contracts that have kept my crew busy through the winter. Sylvia got a raise. Aldous and I did the Collingwood section in September for days, and he complained about his knees the whole time, and I told him to walk faster. Some people have asked me what I'd tell someone in the same situation. What to do if you're older and you start to see the signs, the careful questions, the suggestions about simplifying the way certain people look at your things. I don't know that I have a speech ready, but I know what I'd say first. Call your lawyer before they reach the end of the driveway. Block your accounts that same night and do not sign anything, not anything, with someone else's pen and someone else's explanation of what it means. Eleanor used to say, "The hardest thing about trusting people is that you only find out when they fail you." She was right, as she usually was. But I'll add something she might have said. She'd been there for all of it. The law is slower than betrayal, but it's stronger. It is considerably stronger. People ask me sometimes if I'm bitter. It's a fair question. I think they expect me to say no to wrap it up cleanly. Say it made me stronger. Say I've forgiven and moved on. I'm not going to do that. Some things don't get wrapped up. Some things you just carry differently after a while. What I will say is this. What Gideon did had a logic to it. Not a moral logic. There was none of that. But a cold, calculating one. He looked at a grieving man living alone in a large house, and he made a decision about what that man was worth and what could be taken from him. That's a choice. And choices like that don't happen in a vacuum. They come from somewhere. From years of watching what gets rewarded. From the slow erosion of something that should have been built between a father and a son but wasn't. I have to sit with my part in that. I'm not sure I always taught Gideon the right things about what a person owes another person. I'm not sure I was present enough early enough to show him what it looks like to do right by someone when it costs you something. That's not me excusing what he did. It is absolutely not that. What he did was wrong. Deliberately, legally wrong, and the court said so. But I'm 68 years old, and I've watched enough of life go by to know that people who try to take from others without earning it don't usually end up with much worth having. Not in the long run. Not really. Terrence once said to me after the hearing that the strongest thing I did was pick up the phone before I'd even had time to be properly afraid. He meant it as a compliment about the legal strategy. But I think about it differently now. I think the strongest thing I ever did was spend 30 years building something real, something that existed on paper, in contracts, in tax returns, in the memories of 14 employees and a bookkeeper who locked down the accounts without being asked twice. Gideon could file all the applications he wanted. He couldn't file away the truth of what I'd actually built.